everyone inside. Nobody stays outside in this storm. And Marcus Hale had knocked on 17 doors that night. In 17, every single one had slammed in his face. And some didn't even open far enough for a real conversation, just a crack, then the sound of deadbolts sliding home. Stood in the Montana rain with 19 riders behind him and a garage light glowing ahead, and he knew not what was coming. He lifted his fist and knocked anyway. The door opened wide. If you've ever been turned away when you needed help, most this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow Caleb's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 3 hours before it turned mean. Came off the Beartooth Range the way Montana weather always came, without warning, without apology, and without any interest in what you had planned for the night. In his 9 o'clock, and the highway that cut through the mountain pass was running like a shallow river, in the yellow center line, disappearing under 2 inches of moving water. And the temperature had dropped far enough that the rain was starting to find the edge of sleet. Any bliss upon. Caleb Whitmore heard it hitting the metal roof of his garage and didn't look up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. He'd been at the bench since 6 that morning, 15 hours. His back had stopped complaining about the wooden stool around hour 11, which he knew from experience meant the pain had simply moved past the point where his nervous system could process it as anything other than background noise. His hands moved automatically, cleaning the jets, checking the float, reassembling in the order his father had drilled into him when he was 9 years old, and standing on an overturned milk crate just to reach the workbench. The garage smelled like motor oil, metal shavings, and the ghost of the coffee he'd made at noon and never finished. Portable space heater in the corner pushed out enough warmth to keep his fingers working. And the radio on the shelf above the parts cabinet was tuned to a country station out of Billings that kept cutting in and out with the storm. Every few minutes, the announcer broke through the static to report road closures spreading across 3 counties. Caleb reached over without looking and turned the radio down. He had $1,800 in the bank. The landlord on the building held a lease that came up for renewal in 61 days, and the number the landlord had mentioned casually, the way people mention things they know will hurt, was $400 more per month than Caleb was currently paying. He'd done the math on a napkin that he'd folded up and put in his shirt pocket and hadn't been able to throw away. And the numbers didn't work. He'd tried them 7 different ways, and they kept arriving at the same answer. The carburetor in his hands was the last job he had on the books for the week. And he set it down carefully, pushed back from the bench, and listened to the rain. Knee pawing on his coat before. From the back of the building, through the door that separated the shop from the small apartment he'd built out of the old storage room 3 years ago, he could hear Emma's television. And she'd put herself to bed at 8:30 without being asked, which she did most nights now. And he both loved her for it and found something that lived just below guilt every time it happened. A 9-year-old girl who put herself to bed because she understood that her father was still working, that was either a sign of extraordinary maturity or a sign of something he didn't want to examine too closely. He stood up, walked to the apartment door, and opened it 2 inches. In the sound of cartoons, the small lamp beside her bed throwing yellow light under the gap at the bottom of her bedroom door. Stood there for a moment, just listening to her breathe, and then he pulled the door shut and went back to the bench. He had just picked up the carburetor again. The first motorcycle came off the highway. He heard it before he saw anything, the distinctive sound of a big-bore V-twin engine running rough, any missing on one cylinder, and the kind of sound that to a non-mechanic might suggest the bike was simply loud. But Caleb said clearly that whoever was on it was nursing a problem and had been for a while. And the sound passed in front of the building and then stopped. And he heard voices outside and then more engines, multiple engines, overlapping, and some running better than others, until the parking lot outside his garage held a noise that was somewhere between a motorcycle rally and a mechanical emergency room. He didn't move right away. He set down the carburetor, stood up slowly. He walked to the small window beside the bay door and looked out. 19 motorcycles, some still running, some already shut down. And the riders were dismounting in the rain, some of them moving fast, some of them moving with the careful deliberateness of people who had been cold and wet for a very long time. And through the water on the window glass and the darkness of the parking lot, Caleb could make out the cuts, the leather vests, with the patches that, in his part of Montana, you didn't need anyone to explain to you. He'd grown up here. He knew what those patches meant, or rather, he knew what most people in most towns decided they meant the moment they saw them. Stood at the window for 11 seconds. He counted them later, when he was trying to remember how long it had taken him to decide. Then he walked to the bay door and hit the button. And the overhead door rolled up, and the light from inside the garage spilled out into the rain and the darkness, the parking lot full of wet, road-beaten riders. And the man who came to the door first was the kind of man who filled a doorframe. Not just in size, though he was large, broad, across the shoulders. And the beard, the color of wet wheat, and eyes that had been watching for threats and exits for so long, it had become the natural resting position of his face. But in the way he carried himself, into the way space seemed to rearrange itself around him when he moved. He stopped at the edge of the bay door, rain dripping off the brim of his helmet, which he held in one hand, and he looked at Caleb with the wariness of a man who had been told no enough times in one night that he had begun to expect it as a default. "And we've got mechanical issues," the man said. His voice was deep and even, not aggressive, but carrying the particular flatness of someone who had stripped all the emotion out of the ask because emotion hadn't been helping. "Nebo, multiple bikes down. Need somewhere to get out of this rain while we figure it out." Caleb looked past him at the 19 riders standing in his parking lot. "How many bikes are running bad?" The man blinked. "Eva, that wasn't the question he'd been expecting." 7 confirmed. "Maybe 3 more that made it here, but I wouldn't trust on the road." "In mix, mostly Harleys. 1 Indian. The Indian's the worst." Caleb nodded once. "Get everyone inside," he said. "And nobody stays outside in this storm." He turned and walked back into the garage before the man had a chance to respond, because there was nothing else to say and he had work to do. And the man's name was Marcus Hale, and he'd been riding for 26 years. He told Caleb this about 40 minutes into the night, not as a boast, but as context. The way a person states a relevant credential when they're trying to explain something. He'd ridden in snowstorms and desert heat, and through the kind of flooding in Louisiana after the storm of 5 that had killed 7 people he knew personally. He had been on roads that washed out under him, and roads that froze black without warning, and roads in 3 countries that had no business being called roads at all. He said he had never, in 26 years, had a night go sideways quite like this one had. Started before the rain, he said. He was sitting on an overturned parts crate near the workbench while Caleb crouched beside the Indian, listening to it idle with his eyes closed and his head tilted the way a doctor listens to a chest. Inkter's bike threw a primary chain coming out of Red Lodge. And we stopped to deal with it, lost an hour. By the time we were rolling again, the storm was coming in hard from the northwest and Dougie's carb started flooding. And that's when everything began to stack up. Where were you headed? Caleb asked. He wasn't making conversation. He was listening to the engine and talking to give Marcus something to do other than watch him, because people who watched got in the way. Missoula, chapter gathering. 60 riders from 4 states started in Wyoming this morning. Marcus paused. The rest of the group made it through the pass before the road closed. And we were the tail end. How many doors did you knock on before mine? And the silence that followed that question was its own kind of answer. Enough, Marcus said finally. Caleb reached into the Indian's engine and found what he was looking for by touch. The primary chain was stretched, not thrown. Whoever had installed it last hadn't set the tension correctly, and it had been walking itself loose over several hundred miles until tonight, when the cold and the wet had finished the job. Fixable, not fast, but fixable. Who works on your bikes? He asked. And we've got 2 guys in the chapter who handle most of it. Any good mechanics? Marcus paused. This was just bad luck stacking on bad luck stacking on a bad night. All right. Caleb stood up, wiped his hands, and looked at the row of bikes that had been walked into the bays. India needs a primary chain retensioned and probably reseated. And that's the most time-consuming job. 2 Harleys against the wall, he walked over and crouched beside the first one, pulling off the side cover with the casual efficiency of a man who had done this motion 10,000 times. This one's a fuel delivery problem. Dirty petcock. Maybe 2 hours if the parts are here, and I think they are. The other one. He moved to the second Harley, put his ear near the engine, tapped the tank. This one's vapor locking. You need to check the venting. He stood up and faced Marcus. Give me a list of every bike that's got an issue. What you know about it, and who's the best rider in your group. And Marcus cocked his head slightly. Why the best rider? Because I'm going to need someone to ride each bike once I've got it running. And I want to know who I can trust to tell me if something still sounds wrong. Good rider can feel what I can't always hear. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was more like recalibration, the adjustment a person makes when they've prepared themselves for one kind of person and found themselves standing in front of another kind entirely. That'd be Ryan, Marcus said. Ryan Cole. And Ryan Cole was 23 years old and had the face of someone who was trying very hard to look like he wasn't in pain. Caleb noticed it because he'd spent 9 years noticing things the way Emma held her shoulder when she was trying not to let him know she'd gotten hurt. And the way the old Chevy pickup that lived in the back corner of the lot had been sitting lower on the driver's side for 2 months because the owner kept saying he'd bring it in next week. And Ryan Cole was doing the same thing that all people in pain did when they didn't want to ask for help. He was standing slightly off-center, keeping weight off his left leg, and every few minutes he shifted position in a way that looked casual but wasn't. Caleb waited until Marcus had moved away to the far end of the garage and where the rest of the riders had organized themselves. With a kind of unconscious military efficiency that Caleb found interesting, some sitting, and some standing. Small clusters of conversation happening, nobody getting in the way of the bays, and then he walked up beside Ryan and crouched down next to the bike Ryan had been leaning against. What happened to your leg? Caleb asked. He kept his eyes on the bike. Ryan said nothing for a beat. Nothing. Okay. Caleb checked the tire pressure on the rear wheel with his thumb, which was a thing he'd made up on the spot. When did you go down? Another pause, outside of Columbus. Before the rain got bad, I low-sided on a patch. Bike's fine. And I'm fine. What did you land on? My hip. I said I'm fine. How long ago was Columbus? Ryan hesitated again. In 4 hours, maybe. Caleb stood up and looked at him directly for the first time. Ryan had the kind of blue eyes that were very easy to read, which was probably something he didn't know and wouldn't have liked being told. If you've been riding for 4 hours on a hip injury in cold weather and rain, you need to sit down and you need to get warm or you're going to be a problem later. Not a problem. Not yet. Caleb pointed to the space heater. And there's a chair next to that heater. Sit in it for the next hour. I'm going to need you to ride each bike I finish before we put it back out in that lot. And if you're locked up from cold when I need you, and that's a problem for me. Ryan stared at him. You're telling me to sit down. I'm telling you I need you functional in about 90 minutes. What you do with that information is your business. Ryan looked at the chair, looked back at Caleb. Something passed through his face that wasn't quite irritation and wasn't quite relief. Didn't you always talk to people like this? Like what? Like you're telling them what you need instead of what you think they should do. Caleb picked up his diagnostic light and moved toward the next bike. Sit down, Ryan. Ryan went and sat down. And the thing about working through a problem that big, with that many moving pieces, was that it demanded a kind of total focus that Caleb had always found easier than the alternative. He was inside a mechanical problem, really inside it, facing the fault through the system and feeling his way through the logic of it, the way his father had taught him to think, and not just see, not just look, but understand there was no space left in his head for the other things. The bank balance, the lease, the napkin with numbers that didn't add up. And the memory of Emma's face the first morning. She'd come out of her room and started making her own breakfast because she knew he hadn't been to bed yet. He moved from bike to bike in the order he'd mentally triaged them, and the garage filled up with the sounds of work being done, the ratchet, and the tap of a wrench finding its seat. Low conversation of riders who had settled into the long patience of men accustomed to waiting out conditions. But somewhere around the 50-minute mark, something changed. He'd been working the carburetor on the second Harley, the one with the flooding issue, and he looked up to reach for a different jet and found that someone had already moved it within arm's reach. He paused, looked around. 3 of the riders had quietly positioned themselves around the bays. Not in the way, just adjacent. And one of them, a heavy-set man with a silver beard and the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked with his hands his whole life in sorting through the parts bins on the shelf behind the workbench and organizing them by size, which had needed doing for approximately 2 years. Another one was sweeping the far end of the bay with the push broom that had been leaning against the wall since the previous Tuesday. The third was standing near the bench with a flashlight, angled so it was putting additional light on exactly the space where Caleb had been working. He stood up and looked at the man with the flashlight. And the man looked back at him without expression, holding the light steady. You don't have to do that, Caleb said. I know, the man said. He kept holding the light. Caleb looked at the man sweeping, at the man organizing the bins. He thought about telling them it wasn't necessary. He decided against it. He went back to the carburetor. 20 minutes later, he moved to the next bike, and someone had laid out the tools he would need in order of probable use based, as far as he could tell, and watching what he'd been reaching for over the last hour. Stopped and stared at the organized tools for a moment. And from across the garage, Marcus caught his eye. The big man said nothing. He raised his coffee cup. Slightly, someone had made a fresh pot. Caleb had no idea when, and then looked away. Caleb picked up the first tool and went to work. It was just past midnight when he heard the apartment door open. He'd been expecting it for about 20 minutes, the way you expect things when you know a particular small person well enough. Emma had a sleep cycle that broke around midnight when he was still working, always had she'd come out for water or to find the bathroom and invariably spot the light under the shop door and come through to check on him. He had tried over the years to get her to simply go back to sleep, and she had tried over the years to comply, and they had reached the unspoken mutual understanding that the trying was the thing and not the succeeding. The door opened and Emma came through it in her green pajamas, with the small white stars, her hair pressed flat on one side from her pillow, squinting at the light. And she stopped. She looked at the garage. 19 men, most of them large, most of them in leather, most of them bearing the kind of tattoos and insignia that decorated the walls of a whole genre of movies her father had never let her watch, stared back at a 9-year-old girl in star pajamas holding a water glass. And the garage went very quiet. Emma looked at her father. "Dad," she said, with the careful deliberateness of a child who was gathering data before committing to a reaction. "Annie, there are a lot of people in our garage." "Afe, yeah," Caleb said. He'd come around the bike he was working on and was standing near her, but he didn't move to pick her up or guide her back through the door. Annie waited to see what she'd do. Emma generally needed room to process. She looked back at the assembled riders. Her eyes traveled across the room slowly, the way her eyes always moved when she was doing the thing her teacher called reading the space, which her father called figuring out who's safe. And her eyes landed on Ryan, in the chair by the heater. "Why are you sitting like that?" she asked him. Ryan, who had apparently not been spoken to by a 9-year-old in some time, looked slightly alarmed. "Any gun? Like what? Like your hip hurts?" Ryan opened his mouth and closed it again. From somewhere in the group, someone made a sound that was unmistakably a suppressed laugh. "Fell off my motorcycle," Ryan said finally, with the resigned honesty of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a child in star pajamas. Emma considered this. "Did you cry?" "Emma," Caleb said. "I'm asking because it's okay if he cried," Emma said. It was addressing her father now, with the tone of a Persis clarifying a misunderstood position. "Mrs. Galvez says, it's good to cry when you're hurt because it's honest." "Mrs. Galvez is right," Ryan said. His voice had changed slightly. Caleb couldn't quite identify how. Emma looked at Ryan for another moment, apparently satisfied. Then she turned to the room at large. "Are you all fixing your motorcycles?" "And your dad is," said the heavy-set man with the silver beard, the one who had been organizing the parts bins. His voice was gentle in a way that surprised Caleb. "And we're just keeping him company." Emma nodded as though this were a reasonable arrangement. She looked at her father. "Can I watch for a little while?" "Any 30 minutes, Caleb said. She found a seat on an upended 5-gallon bucket near the workbench, tucked her feet underneath her, and settled in to watch. Nobody in the garage spoke for a moment, and then, gradually quietly, any conversation resumed, and Emma sat in the middle of 19 Hells Angels riders in a storm-battered Montana garage at midnight and watched her father work. The man with the silver beard was named Daniel Brooks. He came and stood near Caleb around 1 a.m. when Caleb had the Indian apart on the bench and was threading the new primary chain through, with the steady, methodical patience that this particular job required if you wanted it done right and not just done. "How long have you had the shop?" Daniel asked. 14 years, Caleb said. "And a plea took it over from my father when I was 28. "You retire?" Caleb didn't look up from the chain. "He died." "I'm sorry, heart attack. He was 55. Caleb seated the chain on the lower sprocket, checked the alignment. He had the shop for 20 years before that. He wanted to retire to Arizona, always talked about it. He never got around to going. That's a hard way to inherit a business. The only way I knew. Caleb reached for the tensioner. He taught me to work on bikes from the time I could hold a wrench. And the shop was always where I went when I needed to figure something out. It still is. Daniel leaned against the bench, not in the way, just present. He had the quality of a man who knew how to take up exactly as much space as he needed, and no more. Live here? In the shop? Back there. Caleb indicated the apartment door with a tilt of his head. He converted the storage room 3 years ago. Made sense at the time. And still makes sense, I guess, since your wife. Caleb's hands didn't pause. We had this kind of conversation before, the careful navigation of it. The question that wasn't quite a question. He learned that the best thing was to answer simply and keep working, because working kept the conversation honest. People said different things when the person they were talking to was focused on something else. He got closer to the real thing. Since my wife, he said. And how old was Emma then? 6. Daniel said nothing for a moment. The rain hit the metal roof above them. The space heater hummed. Ending chanced. From across the garage, 2 riders were having a quiet argument about something that Caleb couldn't quite hear, and another man had fallen asleep against the wall with his arms folded across his chest. And she seems like a good kid, Daniel said. Caleb looked across the garage to where Emma had relocated herself to a spot beside Ryan's chair and was now engaged in what appeared to be a conversation about motorcycles. Based on the hand gestures Ryan was making with his good arm and the expression of focused interest on Emma's face. She's a better person than me, Caleb said. Always has been. And that's a good problem for a parent to have. Yeah. Caleb seated the tensioner and torqued it down. Yeah, it is. At 2 in the morning, Marcus came to stand at the edge of the bay where Caleb was working and watched him for a long moment without speaking. Caleb finished the sequence he was in the middle of, set down the tool, and straightened up. He knew what a person looked like when they had something to say that they hadn't figured out how to start yet. Go ahead, Caleb said. Marcus looked at him steadily. And who told you to help us? What? Nobody called ahead. Nobody sent us to you. You didn't know who we were. You knew who you were. Then why? Because it was raining, Caleb said. Picked up a shop rag and wiped his hands. And because whatever else any of you are, you were also 19 people standing in it, and I had a roof. He looked at Marcus directly. Any father had a saying. He said you can tell everything you need to know about a person by what they do when someone knocks on their door. And Marcus was quiet for a moment. What happened to your father? He died when I was 28. Caleb looked at the Indian engine on the bench. He never closed the shop on anybody. Didn't matter what they drove, what they looked like, what hours they showed up. But a thing he used to say, a locked door isn't just keeping someone out. It's a decision about who you're willing to be. The garage was quiet around them. The storm outside had found a steady rhythm, the rain coming in long, even sheets against the building. He sounds like a man worth knowing, Marcus said. He was. Caleb turned back to the bench. He was the best person I've known outside of Emma. And Marcus stood there for another moment, and he said quietly, and not as a question, and you're about to lose this place. Caleb's hands didn't stop moving. What makes you say that? Because I've been watching you work for 3 hours, Marcus said, and a man who works like you do, and who has a shop like this, and lives in the back room, and hasn't raised his price or his terms, or offered to charge us anything extra for a middle-of-the-night emergency. That's a man who's not working because business is good. That's a man who's working because he's out of options. Caleb set down the wrench. He stood there, with his hands flat on the bench and his eyes on the engine and the rain against the roof, and for a moment the garage felt very large around him. 61 days, he said. That's when the lease comes up. And the landlord wants $400 more a month than I'm paying. Can you make that number? Caleb picked the wrench back up. Not currently. What would it take? More customers. Different location, maybe. Something I don't have. He seated the wrench on the bolt he'd been heading for. And it takes is what I don't have, which is the way most problems work. And Marcus said nothing. He stood there and watching Caleb work for a long minute. And then he turned and walked back across the garage to where his riders were gathered. And Caleb heard the low sound of Marcus's voice, entering a conversation that was too quiet for him to follow. He went back to the engine. He had 9 more bikes to finish before morning. Picked up the pace, and by 3:30 in the morning, and the storm had found its peak, and then slowly began to release. And the rain didn't stop. It wouldn't stop until nearly dawn, but it shifted from the hammering intensity that had been making conversation difficult into something steadier and less violent. And the pressure in the air changed in the way that it does when the worst of a system has passed and what remains is just the trailing edge of it, still serious but no longer threatening in the same immediate way. Caleb had 6 bikes done and 3 more in various stages. And Ryan Cole had ridden each finished motorcycle in careful circuits of the parking lot, coming back each time with a clear and specific report. This one pulls slightly left, and this one's throttle response feels sticky low in the range. And this one's good. This one needs another look at the rear brake that confirmed what Caleb had already thought. And Ryan was, as Marcus had said, the best rider in the group. He had the kind of mechanical sensitivity in his hands and seat that couldn't be learned. You either had it or you didn't. Between circuits, and Ryan had come back to the garage and, at some point that Caleb couldn't quite pinpoint, started helping. And not with the engines he hadn't been asked, and he knew enough not to reach into someone else's work without an invitation. But with everything around the work and the tools, the light, the running of parts from the shelf, inserting of what Caleb reached before Caleb reached for it. Picked it up by watching, and he was good enough at watching that by the 4th hour he was anticipating correctly about 70% of the time. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything. Emma had been sent back to bed at 1:30 after she'd fallen asleep on her bucket with her chin in her hands, and Caleb had carried her through to her room and set her down without waking her. He'd come back to find that the garage, in his absence, had continued to function exactly as it had been. The organized tools, the steady company, and the quiet competence of men who had decided to be useful. At 4 in the morning, with 4 bikes still to go, he stopped at the bench and drank a full cup of coffee without tasting it and stood there for a moment with his hands wrapped around the mug and his eyes closed. He was thinking about his father. Not about the lease, not about the money, not about the math on the napkin. He was thinking about a specific afternoon when he was 17, when a man had come into the shop late on a Friday with a truck that was making a sound the man couldn't afford to fix and couldn't afford to ignore. His father had worked on that truck until 9 o'clock. He charged the man $40, which was about a third of what the time was worth. And when Caleb had asked him why, his father had looked at him with the expression he used when he thought Caleb was missing something obvious. Because that's what the man has, his father had said. But we need the money too, Caleb had said. His father had wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Son, we always need money. But you can always make more money. You can't make more of the kind of person you want to be. A decision you make once, 100 times a day, and after a while, it's just who you are." Caleb opened his eyes. He set down the coffee cup. He went back to work. The 4th bike came back to life at 4:17 in the morning. And Ryan heard it from across the garage that particular moment when an engine that had been running wrong suddenly found its rhythm. The sound shifting from ragged and uncertain into something clean and steady and right. He heard that sound hundreds of times in his life, but something about hearing it in this garage, at this hour, this NEV with this man at the controls, made it land differently than usual. He looked up. Caleb was already moving to the next one. No celebration, no pause, just a ratchet going back to work. Ryan had been watching Caleb Whitmore for 5 hours now, and he'd started to understand something that he couldn't quite put words to, yet something about the way the man moved through work and the way he treated each job as though it was the only job, even at 4 in the morning, with 3 more bikes waiting, and his eyes carrying the particular flatness of a man running on fumes. There was no performance in it, no angle. Caleb wasn't fixing motorcycles to impress anyone. He was fixing them because they were broken, and he could fix them. And that, as far as Caleb seemed to be concerned, was the complete logic of the situation. Ryan had known a lot of mechanics. He'd grown up around them, been around them his whole riding life. And most mechanics were good people, but most mechanics also had a thing, a pride thing, a money thing, a territorial thing about their bench and their tools and the particular way they liked to work. A closed-off quality that was part skill and part armor. Caleb didn't have the armor. Ryan had been trying to figure out why that bothered him so much, and around 4 in the morning he finally understood it didn't bother him. It scared him, because a man without armor in a world that hit as hard as this one did was either very stupid or very certain of something Ryan didn't yet know how to be certain of, and watching Caleb work, and watching the way he moved from job to job with that complete, unhurried focus, Ryan was starting to think it wasn't stupidity. He stood up from the chair. His hip had loosened enough that he could do it without the careful negotiation it had required 3 hours ago, and walked over to where Caleb was crouched beside the next Harley. "And what do you need?" Ryan asked. Caleb didn't look up. "In 14mm socket, 3-inch extension." And Ryan found it in the organized tray on the bench. He placed it in Caleb's hand. Caleb used it without comment. Then, after a moment, "How's the hip?" "And better. Good. I've got 2 more after this one. I need you to ride the one I just finished. And tell me what you think about the throttle response above 40. And I'll tell you now, it was a little sticky in the low range." He adjusted it. "Tell me if it's better." Ryan went to get his helmet. Behind him, he heard Caleb say, quietly, and to no one in particular, "And so, you're good at this." Ryan stopped, turned around. At what? Caleb was back in the engine, not looking at him. And knowing what a mechanic needs before he reaches for it. "And where'd you learn that?" Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Dad had a shop. When I was a kid, I used to hand him tools the same way you hand a surgeon instruments. He never had to ask twice. What happened to the shop?" Pause. "He lost it when I was 16. Ryan's voice stayed even, but something under it didn't. Ink came for it. He never really got back up from that." Caleb stopped moving, just for a second. Then he went back to the bolt. "I'm sorry, long time ago. Doesn't make it shorter," Caleb said. And Ryan stood there for a moment with his helmet in his hand. He put it on and went outside to ride the bike. And the throttle was perfect. He sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the rain still falling, and lighter now than it had been. And he thought about his father's shop, which he hadn't thought about in years, and about the fact that he had just told a stranger something he hadn't told most of the people he'd ridden with for the better part of a decade. He went back inside. "Throttle's good," he told Caleb. "And good," Caleb said, and reached for the next tool. And Ryan sat back down in the chair by the heater. He stayed awake this time. And the man with the silver beard, Daniel Brooks, had been moving quietly through the group for the past hour. The way a man moves when he's used to being in situations where there's work to be done and someone needs to take inventory of who's able to do what. And he'd been a firefighter for 22 years before he retired. He'd told Ryan once, and the thing about that work was that it taught you to read a room in about 4 seconds. Anything who was holding it together, any who was fraying, and who needed something to do before they started making problems out of boredom or anxiety. And this group of 19 people was holding it together. And they were tired and wet and road-beaten, and the night had gone badly in about 6 different ways, but they were holding it together because that was what this particular group of people did. And what Daniel was reading now wasn't the group's stress level. He was reading the room for something else. He was reading Caleb Whitmore. He'd been doing it since about the second hour, and collecting details the way he used to collect information at a scene, quietly, and then without drawing attention to it, and he building a picture from the pieces. And the apartment door at the back of the garage. The parts bins that were organized but low on certain sizes. And the lack of any recent model shop equipment, and the carefully maintained older tools that were, every single one of them, any quality, not the cheap kind, not the shortcuts, just the good original tools that a man's father might have bought new decades ago, and a son had kept in working order ever since. An invoice clipboard near the register that Daniel had been close enough to see briefly without being caught looking. And the numbers on those invoices were not the numbers of a thriving business. Angel walked over to Marcus, who was sitting on an equipment case near the far wall, watching Caleb work. "He's underwater," Daniel said, low enough that it didn't carry. And Marcus didn't look at him. "I know. How bad? Bad enough that he's living in his own storage room and his kid puts herself to bed." Marcus paused. "And he hasn't mentioned it once. Hasn't made a reference to what this is worth. Hasn't angled for anything. Helped us because it was the right thing to do, and apparently that's just the whole calculation." Daniel sat down on the case beside him. They were both quiet for a moment, watching Caleb thread the new primary chain on the Indian with the slow, steady precision of a man who was not going to rush this job just because it was 5 in the morning. "Father built this place," Daniel said. "I know that too. And he's about to lose it." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Not if I can help it." Daniel looked at him. Marcus still wasn't looking back. His eyes were on Caleb, and his expression had the quality it got when he'd made a decision and was now just letting the weight of it settle. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked. "I'm thinking," Marcus said slowly, "that this is the kind of man we don't leave behind." Daniel nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. And across the garage, Indian's engine turned over and caught in the sound rising and finding its rhythm, and Caleb sat back and listened to it, run with his hands on his knees and his eyes half closed. And there was something in his face in that moment, not pride exactly, but something close to peace that Daniel thought a man ought to be able to wear every day, and not just in the moments when he'd fixed something. Stood up and went to make another pot of coffee. And the night still had a few hours left in it. There was more work to do. It was around 5:30 when Emma came back out. And not for water this time, and she came out fully awake, and dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, and her hair brushed, and carrying the battered children's backpack she used as a catch-all, and she walked through the garage door and looked around with the alert, purposeful expression of a child who had made a plan while no one was watching. She went directly to the small folding table near the garage entrance where someone had set up the coffee situation, and she opened her backpack and she produced a box of granola bars, a bag of apples, and a sleeve of plastic cups with the confidence of a person who had assessed the logistical situation and arrived with solutions. "And he found these," she announced to the room. "We also have peanut butter, but the jar is almost empty, so it might not go very far." And Dad keeps crackers on the second shelf in the cabinet, and I can get those too, if anybody wants them. And the garage went very quiet again, but differently this time. And the first time Emma had appeared, it was surprise. And this time, it was something else. And the heavy-set man who'd been organizing the parts bins whose name Caleb had learned, Hector, whose primary chain had started the whole cascade, made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. He reached out and took a granola bar from the box she was holding and said, "Thank you, instinct, sweetheart," in a voice that sounded like he meant it in a way that went past the granola bar. Emma moved through the room with her box and her bag, distributing food with the earnest efficiency of a child who had decided this was her contribution and was committed to making it a good one. When she reached Ryan, she stopped. "Your hip is better," she said, not as a question. Ryan looked down at her. He was smiling, Caleb noticed. Not the polite smile of an adult managing a child, but an actual smile. "Yeah, it is. It's because you sat by the heater." She handed him a granola bar. "Heat helps with muscle injuries. Dad taught me that." "And your dad knows a lot of things," Ryan said. Emma considered this with the gravity of someone fact-checking a claim. "He knows a lot about engines and some things about being a dad, and less about cooking than he thinks." She moved on to the next person. From across the garage, Caleb watched his daughter make her way through 19 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, handing out granola bars and apples and unsolicited medical observations. And he felt something that was too large and too specific to have a proper name. And something that occupied the space between gratitude and grief and love and the particular ache of being a parent in a moment that proves your child has grown into more than you knew. Marcus appeared at his shoulder. "She's something," Marcus said. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Takes after you." Caleb shook his head. "She takes after her mother." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Mother must have been a good person, the best I knew." Caleb turned back to the last bike. "She was better at opening doors than I am." He said it without looking up, without any particular weight on it, just as a fact. But Marcus heard what was underneath it, the way a person hears what's underneath something when they've been paying attention. "I don't know about that," Marcus said. "I knocked on 17 doors tonight." Caleb didn't respond. He was back in the engine, and his hands were moving, and the garage was full of the sound of work and weather and the low conversation of 19 people finding their way through an unexpected night. In show, but something in his jaw had changed. Something in the set of his shoulders. And Marcus, who had been watching people for a long time, saw it and said nothing more. In 6 in the morning, Caleb's had 17 motorcycles running. Stood in the middle of the garage with 2 bikes still to go and a body that had moved past exhaustion into the strange, hollow clarity that comes from the far side of it, where everything feels sharp and specific and slightly unreal. He knew from experience that this was the state where you made mistakes, where your hands knew what to do, but the layer of judgment that checked your hands was running thin. He drank water. He ate one of Emma's granola bars. He stood still for 60 seconds, which was the longest he'd been still since 9 o'clock the previous evening. Indy Ryan materialized beside him. "Sit down for 10 minutes, Ryan said. "I'll start tearing down the next one, and you can take over when you're ready." Caleb looked at him. "You know how to diagnose. I watched you do it 9 times. Ryan's voice was even. "You know what I'm looking for on this model. If I find something I don't recognize, I'll stop and wait. I won't touch what I'm not sure about." Caleb studied him for a moment. And he said, "Left side panel first. Check the main feed line before you pull anything else." "Got it." Caleb sat down. He sat in the chair Ryan had vacated by the heater and he put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he breathed. And just breathed. And the garage moved around him. He could hear it. Any activity. And Ryan's voice asking Daniel something quietly. Emma somewhere behind him, explaining to two riders the correct method for storing granola bars so they didn't go stale. And the sound of the second-to-last bite getting taken apart, with careful, respectful hands. Thought about his father. He thought about the afternoon. His father had sat down in this same chair, different chair, then older, but same position, same exhaustion after a 20-hour stretch, fixing a semi that had broken down on the highway and whose driver had been stranded with a load of time-sensitive freight. His father had sat down and put his face in his hands exactly like this. And 17-year-old Caleb had said, "Dad, you should sleep." And his father had said, "I will." First, tell me what you learned today. Caleb had listed the things. The mechanical things, the diagnostic steps, the sequence. His father had listened and then said, "That's good." But that's not what I mean. Caleb had frowned. Then what do you mean? His father had looked up from his hands. His eyes had been the same bloodshot, far edge of tired that Caleb's eyes were right now. And he'd said, "I mean, what did you learn about the driver?" Caleb had thought about it. He was scared, he'd said finally. About the load, about his job, and he couldn't afford to show it. His father had nodded. "Now you're learning." Caleb lifted his face from his hands. Dion. Across the garage, Ryan was elbow-deep in the second-to-last bike, working with the focused care of someone who had been taught how to respect a machine. And Daniel was beside him, holding the light, the same way he'd held the light for Caleb 3 hours ago. And Marcus was sitting near the garage door and watching both of them, and there was something on his face that Caleb Cams recognized from the mirror. The look of a person carrying more responsibility than they'd ever asked for. And it'd be because they'd chosen to, and because no one else was better placed to carry it, and finding in that carrying something that was almost, and be quiet, but not quite, in like peace. They were all tired. They were all wet. The night had cost them something: time, energy, the specific toll of a journey gone sideways. And not one of them had complained, not once, not to him. Caleb sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and went back to the last bike. He was 3/4 through it when Marcus came and stood beside him again. And this time Marcus had something in his hand. It was the invoice clipboard from near the register. He held it out. Caleb stopped. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at Marcus. "I wasn't looking for anything," Marcus said. And he left it on the bench when he got coffee. "I'm not trying to be in your business." "And what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to have an honest conversation." Marcus set the clipboard down on the bench between them, not pushing it toward Caleb, just setting it there. "And you're 2 months from a lease increase you can't meet. Your parts inventory is low. Your equipment is old and maintained by hand because replacing it isn't in the budget. And you fixed 17 motorcycles tonight in 9 hours alone, and you haven't charged us for the labor yet." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "What's your point?" "And my point," Marcus said, "is that the kind of mechanic you are doesn't disappear. And the kind of person you are doesn't disappear. And I've got 60 riders in Missoula right now who need a shop they can trust." He paused. "And I know a lot more than 60 riders." Caleb was quiet. "And I'm not talking about charity," Marcus said, and his voice had an edge to it now, and then not hard, and shitty, but precise, and the edge of a man who needed something to be understood, exactly as he meant it. "And I'm talking about business. I'm talking about what happens when 19 people tell every rider they know that there's a mechanic in Montana who opens his door at midnight in a storm and fixes your bike like it's his own and charges you fair. And that's word of mouth," Caleb said. "That takes time. Takes less time than you think when the word comes from us. Marcus held Caleb's gaze. You know people in every state, every chapter. Riders who travel the Beartooth Highway. Riders who come through this pass all summer. This road goes somewhere, Caleb. Your shop is on a road that goes somewhere. Caleb looked down at the engine he was working on. His hands were still. He hadn't let them go still all night. You don't want to be owed anything, he said. You're not being owed, Marcus said. You're being seen. There's a difference. He picked up the clipboard and set it back near the register. Think about it. He walked away. Caleb stood at the bench for a long moment. The engine in front of him waited. The tools were laid out in the order Ryan had organized them, precise and ready, anticipating the next sequence of work. Picked up the wrench. He thought about his father's question, what did you learn today? Not the mechanical things, not the diagnostic sequence. Any other thing. He thought about what it felt like when 17 people he'd never met had decided, quietly, and without being asked, and to treat his garage like it mattered. And to organize his bins and sweep his floor, hold his light and sit with his daughter and hand him tools before he reached for them. He thought about what it felt like to not be alone in the work. He'd forgotten that feeling. And he hadn't realized he'd forgotten it until just now, standing at the bench at 6 a.m, with the last engine in front of him and the rain finally, slowly, beginning to ease off the roof above. Tightened the final bolt. He started the engine. It ran clean and strong from the first revolution, and the sound of it moved through the garage, and every person in that garage heard it and knew what it meant. The last one was done. Nobody cheered. Nobody made a big thing of it, but the room changed. Inkster let out a long breath and pressed his hands flat on his knees. And Daniel looked up from where he'd been sitting and gave a single slow nod. Ryan stood up from his chair and came over and looked at the running engine and said, that's it, with the simple certainty of a person stating a fact that means more than the words. Emma, who had fallen asleep again in the chair by the heater sometime around 5:30, woke up at the sound, sat up, and looked at her father and said, did you fix them all? I need all 19, Caleb said. She considered this for a moment. Good, she said, with the satisfied finality of a child who had never really doubted it would happen. And then she put her head back down on her folded arms. And Marcus stood at the far end of the garage, looking at Caleb across the length of it. And what was on his face now was not the wary calculation of the man who'd stood in the rain outside, expecting one more door to close. It was something harder to name, something older, the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to be surprised by almost nothing, and who has just been surprised. He held Caleb's gaze for a long moment, and he said, and across the garage, entity, loud enough for the room, everybody up. And get these bikes loaded and let this man sleep. The room moved. 19 people, organized and efficient, began preparing to leave. And Caleb stood beside the last running engine and listened to the rain on the roof, which was softer now and almost gentle, and felt the particular quiet of a long job finally finished, and thought about doors. His father had said a locked door wasn't just keeping someone out. It was a decision about who you were willing to be. Stood in the open garage with the storm easing above him, and he thought, I know who I'm willing to be. Always known. It just felt different now to have a room full of people who'd seen it. And the last motorcycle rolled out of the garage at 6:48 in the morning. Caleb stood in the bay door and watched them go, not all at once, but in the careful, staged way that a group of experienced riders moves when the road is still wet and the light is still gray and the conditions demand respect. And gone. One by one, the engines turned out of the parking lot and onto the highway, the sound of them rising and then fading as they found their speed, and the distance opened up between them and the garage. And Ryan was the last one out. He stopped his bike at the edge of the lot and looked back at Caleb for a moment, just a look, nothing theatrical, and the kind of look that passes between people who have worked through something together and don't yet have the words for what that something was. He nodded once, and Caleb nodded back, and Ryan pulled out onto the highway and was gone. And the sound faded. The garage was quiet in a way it hadn't been for 10 hours. Caleb stood in the bay door and listened to the last of the rain dripping off the roof. And he was so tired torch that the silence felt physical, like a thing pressing against him from all sides. His hands were stiff. His back had gone past the point of pain and arrived somewhere that felt less like his own body and more like a suit of concrete he was wearing over himself. He'd been awake for nearly 24 hours. He turned around and looked at the garage. It was cleaner than when the night had started. That hit him somewhere unexpected. Stood there, looking at the organized parts bins, the swept floor, and the bench wiped down and the tools arranged, and he felt something move through him that he didn't know what to do with. He did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with. He put it aside and kept moving. Pulled the bay door down, turned off the big overheads, and checked the apartment door. Emma was asleep in her chair, still in her jeans and sweatshirt, her head on her folded arms. Picked her up, and she was heavier than he remembered. She was always heavier than he remembered. In the way children gain weight in increments that are invisible until you're holding them, and he carried her through to her room and put her down and pulled the blanket up and stood there for a moment in the dark. She hadn't moved at all. He went back to the shop, sat down on the stool at the workbench, and put his face in his hands. He wasn't thinking about Marcus's offer. He wasn't thinking about the lease or the invoice or the numbers on the napkin that still lived in his shirt pocket. He was thinking about the sound of 19 engines all running right and seeing one after another and through the dark and the rain. Each one a problem solved, each one a person who would make it home now instead of not. He thought that was a good night's work. And then he thought, I can't afford another one. He sat there for a long time. Then he lay down on the floor of the shop on the rubber mat beside the workbench that had served this purpose before and would serve it again, and he was asleep in 45 seconds. He slept for 6 hours without moving. He woke up to the sound of his phone. He didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer it. The policy he'd developed over the past year, the calls from numbers he didn't recognize, had started being primarily collectors and landlords, and the kind of automated system that put you on hold immediately after connecting. But something made him pick up. Maybe it was the 6 hours of sleep. Maybe it was the strange and specific mood of a person who has come through a long night and arrived on the other side of it feeling, against all reason, lighter. In Nick Moore's garage, he said, force of habit. This Caleb? The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, carrying the particular rasp of a man who'd spent a lot of years with his face in the wind. He name's Pete Sarver. I ride with the Billings chapter. And Marcus Hale told me about you. Caleb sat up. He told you this morning? Caleb said. He left here 3 hours ago. He called me from the road, Pete said. And I've got a 9 Road King that's been making a noise I don't like since spring. And 3 shops looked at it. Nobody found anything. Marcus says you're the man. Caleb stood up off the mat. He was already thinking about the Road King, about the kinds of noises a 2009 Road King made that 3 shops could miss, which narrowed it down considerably. And when can you bring it in? How's tomorrow morning? I'll be here, Caleb said. He hung up. He stood there for a moment in the quiet garage. He went and made coffee. He was on his second cup when the second call came in. By the end of the day, he had 4 appointments on the books. 4 new customers, all of them riders, all of them referred by someone who had either been in his garage the night before or had heard about it from someone who had. Stood at the appointment book, actual paper, spiral bound, in the same kind his father had used, and looked at the 4 entries and then looked at the blank spaces that had been there for 2 weeks running and did not try to calculate what it meant or whether it was enough. He'd learned, somewhere in his 30s, that the right response to a thing going right was not to immediately start calculating the odds against it. And the right response was to be present for it and let it be what it was. He called Emma in from where she'd been sitting on the front step since she woke up, doing something with her sketchbook. And in 4 appointments, he told her. She looked at the book, and she looked at him. From the bikers. And she processed this in the way she processed most things, which was by getting very still for a moment and then getting unstill all at once. And she crossed the garage and hugged him around the middle, her head against his sternum, and he put his hand on her hair and stood there. Good, she said, into his shirt. The one with the silver beard was really nice. Daniel, he told me he used to be a firefighter. I know. He said people used to look at firefighters different before they understood what firefighters did. She pulled back and looked up at him. He said sometimes you have to know somebody before you know who they are. Not. Caleb looked at his daughter. When did he tell you that? He asked. When you were sleeping on the floor, she said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a child who did not understand why this would be surprising. He opened his mouth and closed it. I was sitting with him while he drank his coffee, she added. He waited until you woke up to make sure you were okay. I don't think he wanted to leave until he was. Caleb turned back to the appointment book. He wrote Daniel's name at the bottom of the page with a question mark as a reminder to himself. And he went to check the inventory on what he'd need for the Road King. And 3 days passed. The calls kept coming. Not a flood, nothing dramatic or sudden, nothing that would have read to an outsider as a transformation rather than a minor uptick, but steady. And he 1, 2, and sometimes 3 a day, each one a rider, each one with a name and a referral and a bike, with a problem that other shops had either missed or dismissed or charged too much to fix. Tease. Word was moving through a network that Caleb didn't fully understand the shape of, through the channels that communities use when they've found something they trust and want to keep to themselves a little. Indeed, the way people used to pass a restaurant recommendation before the internet made everyone's opinion equally loud and equally disposable. He worked the appointments methodically, the way he worked everything. He didn't rush. He didn't oversell. He told people what he found and that it would cost to fix and what he recommended and why. And he left the decision to them. Every single one of them came back. On the 4th day, Marcus came back. And he came alone this time, which was different. Enough from how Caleb had first met him that it took Caleb a moment to place the particular quality of the visit. Not a leader managing a group, but a man having a conversation. And this backed his bike into the far bay, which Caleb had kept open without quite admitting to himself why. And he came into the garage and set his helmet on the bench and looked at Caleb with the directness that seemed to be the only mode Marcus operated in. "I want to talk about the offer," Marcus said. Caleb put down what he was working on. He'd been expecting this. He'd been thinking about it for 4 days and turning it over the way you turn over a mechanical problem when you're not at the bench, and working through the angles and looking for the place where the logic failed. And tell me what you're actually proposing, Caleb said. And then Marcus sat down on the parts, crate the same one from the first night, and laid it out plainly. Wasn't complicated. And what Marcus was proposing was an informal partnership. Caleb's garage would become the preferred service shop for the Montana chapters and through word of mouth in their network and for traveling riders who came through the Beartooth corridor. And Marcus and his chapter would help finance a modest expansion of the service bays and get Caleb set up with a parts account that their size could unlock better pricing, faster delivery, and the kind of supplier relationship that required volume Caleb didn't currently have alone. In return, Caleb would handle their bikes at a fair, agreed rate and keep the shop honest, the way he'd kept it honest all his life, and accept that this was a business arrangement and not a debt. No charity, Marcus said. That's not what this is. Oh, Caleb said. Then what's your question? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was sitting across from Marcus on the tall shop stool, and he had his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He was doing the same thing he did when he was inside a mechanical problem, not looking at the surface, but feeling for the fault line. My question, Caleb said, is what happens if I can't hold up my end? And Marcus looked at him steadily. What do you mean? I mean, what if the volume overwhelms me? What if I can't hire help fast enough, or the expansion costs more than projected, or I get sick and I'm out for 2 weeks? NEB, what happens to the agreement then? Then we figure it out, Marcus said. Like people who have an agreement figure things out. And that's not a legal answer. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. And you want a contract? Caleb thought about it. I want to understand what kind of agreement this is. And because a contract with a lawyer says one thing. What you're describing sounds like something else. Marcus nodded slowly. It's the other kind. The kind where two people look at each other and both of them understand what's at stake, and neither one of them wants to be the person who breaks it. He paused. We've been working on that kind of agreement for a long time. And longer than any contract I've ever signed. Caleb looked at him. And the mechanic who opens his door at midnight, Marcus said, doesn't need a contract to tell him to do the right thing. I don't think I need one either. Caleb set down his coffee cup. He reached out his hand. Marcus shook it. Firm, brief, final. In condition, Caleb said, before Marcus could stand up. Marcus looked at him. Name it, Ryan Cole. Marcus's expression shifted. Not alarmed, but watchful. What about him? He's good with engines. Better than he knows. Caleb picked up his coffee again. And I'm going to need help if this thing goes the way you're describing. I want him here. Not full-time yet. Not if he's got other commitments. But regularly. I'll pay him fair and I'll teach him what I know. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Ryan's had a complicated road. No. Caleb looked at him over the rim of the cup. And so did the bikes that came in here Friday night. And something passed through Marcus's face. And briefly, but Caleb caught it in CB surprise. And underneath the surprise, in the particular softness of a man who has been advocating for someone a long time and has just found an unexpected ally. I'll talk to him, Marcus said. Tell him I need someone who already knows how to hold a light, Caleb said. Everything else I can teach. Marcus stood up. He picked up his helmet. He looked around the garage, the clean bench, and the organized bays, and the appointment book on the register counter, and his expression was the one Caleb was starting to recognize as Marcus's version of approval. Inch didn't announce itself, but settled quietly over the features like something coming into focus. And your father built something real here, Marcus said. Did, Caleb said. You kept it real. I tried. And Marcus headed for the door. That's all any of us can do. He left. Caleb stood in the garage and heard the motorcycle start and pull out onto the highway. And he stood there until the sound was gone. And it was just him and the empty base and the appointment book and the tools lined up the way his father lined them up 40 years ago. He thought about the handshake, The kind of agreement where two people looked at each other and both understood what was at stake. He'd made that kind of agreement before. Once, standing at a grave in the October rain, and with no one to shake hands with, in just the weight of a promise going one direction into the ground. He told Emma's mother, "I'll keep her safe. I'll keep the shop. I'll make it work." He hadn't been sure he could keep all three. Picked up the phone and called the next appointment to confirm. The call with Pete Sarver about the Road King went 20 minutes because Pete turned out to be the kind of rider who wanted to understand what was wrong with his bike and he not just have it fixed. And Caleb was the kind of mechanic who found that quality in a customer enormously satisfying. In the end of the call, he'd walk Pete through 3 possible causes for the noise, the most likely being a primary bearing starting to fail. Problem that would have found its own catastrophic solution if left another 6 months. And Pete had said, "Marcus was right about you," with the specific tone of a man who does not hand out that kind of comment without meaning it. "What did Marcus say?" Caleb asked. "He said you're the kind of mechanic who works on the bike like it's yours," Pete said. "He said he could tell by the way you listened to the engine before you touched it." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," he said. He hung up and sat with that for a while. The next call came in 40 minutes later, and this one wasn't about a motorcycle. It was the landlord. Caleb heard the voice and felt the specific dropping sensation in his stomach that this particular voice always produced the careful, apologetic, but not really tone of a man who has made a business decision and is now managing the social cost of it. "Caleb, just calling to follow up on our conversation about the renewal," the landlord said. "You know the number I gave you was a stretch, and I want you to know I didn't take that lightly. But the market out here has moved, and I understand," Caleb said. He paused. The landlord had been expecting more pushback. "And they want to give you as much time as I can to figure out your options. If you need, I'm going to meet the new number," Caleb said. In silence, "I'm sorry," the landlord said, "the 400 increase. And I'll meet it." Caleb was looking at the appointment book as he said it. Concede a fee short extension on the first payment at the new rate, 3 weeks, while some new accounts settle in. After that, I'll be current. The landlord was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "And you've had some new business come in?" "I have," Caleb said. "Motorcycle service. I'm expanding the bays." Another pause. "Indies go. Well, that's good to hear, Caleb. I'll get the paperwork drawn up." "Appreciate it," Caleb said. He hung up. He sat very still for a moment. And he opened the desk drawer and found the napkin with the numbers on it and looked at them for a long time. And he folded it up differently, in the opposite direction of how it had been folded before, and so it didn't fall back into the same crease. And he put it in the drawer and closed it. He didn't throw it away. He wasn't ready to throw it away yet. And he put it away. That evening, Ryan Cole showed up. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up, his bike in the lot, his helmet under his arm, and wearing the same jacket he'd been wearing the night of the storm. And he stood in the bay door the same way Marcus had stood in the bay door 9 days ago, waiting to see if it was going to open. And Caleb was at the bench. He heard the bike pull up, and he heard the footsteps, and he knew who it was before he looked up because of the particular timing, not too fast, and not hesitating, just deliberate. And Ryan moved the same way he rode, Caleb had decided, and with precision and a specific kind of controlled care. "Marcus talked to you," Caleb said. "Marcus talked to me," Ryan confirmed. And Ryan set his helmet on the near end of the bench, the same way he'd done things throughout the long night of the storm, finding a place for everything, not cluttering the workspace. "I want to understand what you're actually offering." Marcus gave me his version. I want yours. Caleb looked at him. You come to work here on a schedule we agree on. You work beside me, and I teach you what I know about diagnosis, repair, and how to run a shop that people trust. We pay you fair, not generous. Not yet, because the margin doesn't support generous yet, but fair. And when the margin improves, the pay improves. That's the whole offer. I told Marcus why. Tell me. Caleb set down the tool in his hand and turned to face him directly. Because you've got the instinct. That thing where you know what the mechanic needs before he reaches for it. That's not technique, that's feel. I teach anyone who's willing to work. Feel is either there or it isn't. He paused, and because you told me about your father's shop, and because you went and sat in that chair when I told you to. Not because I outranked you, but because you understood it was the right thing for the work. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. I don't have a lot of experience, he said. And formal. I know, I'm not hiring your resume. Caleb turned back to the bench. I'm hiring the person who handed me tools in the right order at 4 in the morning after 9 hours of watching. And Ryan looked at the garage, the clean bays, the organized bench, the space heater in the corner that was on against the evening chill. He looked at the stool near the workbench and at the tools laid out in a sequence Caleb had been using before he came in. He walked over and picked up the next tool in the sequence. Held it out. Caleb looked at it, looked at Ryan. You start Monday, Caleb said. He took the tool and went back to work. And Ryan pulled the other stool up to the bench and sat down. And for the next hour, he watched Caleb work and asked the right questions at the right times and didn't ask the wrong ones. And by the end of the hour, Caleb had the clear and settled feeling of a man who has made a correct decision and knows it. That feeling was rare enough in his life that he recognized it immediately. He recognized it because it felt in a very specific and particular way, like something his father would have approved of. He kept working. Ryan kept watching. Inside, the Montana evening came down over the mountains and the highway, and the first stars appeared above the pass where 9 days ago, 19, people had found themselves stranded in the rain and had knocked on a door that opened. Inside the garage, in Steo, the work continued, into the way it had always continued, in the way Caleb Whitmore's father had taught him it should. Steady, honest, and without an audience, because the work itself was the point. And the door stayed open. Ryan Cole showed up Monday morning at 7:58. Not 8 o'clock, not 8:10 with an apology, and 7:58, with coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other, in the spiral-bound kind that cost $1.49 at the gas station, and already open to the first page with 3 questions written in it that he'd been sitting on since Friday evening. Caleb noticed the notebook before he noticed the coffee, and he noticed both before Ryan had crossed the threshold of the bay door. Because these were the kinds of details that told you what you actually needed to know about a person before they said a single word. And you write down questions, Caleb asked. When I don't want to forget them, Ryan said. He set the coffee on the bench, not in the workspace, and just beside it, in the correct placement, in the instinct again, and held up the notebook. And he had 3 I couldn't work out on my own. What are they? Angel, Ryan looked at the first page. First, when you're listening to an engine with your eyes closed, what specifically are you listening for? And because I watched you do it 11 times that night, and I can't tell if you're listening for something you already know or something you don't know yet. Caleb picked up his coffee. Both, he said. You're building a picture from what's there and comparing it against what should be there. And the gap between those two things is the problem. He looked at Ryan. Next, second, the Road King you fixed for Pete Sarver. And primary bearing failure. You diagnosed it over the phone before you'd seen the bike. How? He described the noise as a low-frequency rumble that got worse under load and disappeared above 60 miles per hour. In sheep, primaries don't fail clean, they warn you. The specific pattern he described matched a bearing that's starting to walk. And the load-dependent characteristic told me which bearing. Caleb set his cup down. In third, Ryan looked at the notebook. Third is different. Indy, go ahead. How do you know when to trust what you hear versus what the customer tells you? Because sometimes they're not the same thing. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ryan with the expression he reserved for questions that deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. And the customer tells you what they experienced, he said. And the bike tells you what happened. Both of them are telling the truth. And your job is to find where those two truths meet. He turned toward the first bay. Sarver said it got worse on long stretches. Bike told me the bearing had been walking for months. And met in the middle. He'd been taking longer trips than usual this summer. More load, more heat, more time for a slow failure to accelerate. He glanced back at Ryan. And he closed the notebook. You'll learn more from doing. Ryan closed the notebook. He put it in his back pocket. He picked up the first tool Caleb pointed to, and the work began. And the first week was quiet in the way that first weeks of something real tend to be not dramatic, not filled with revelations, but dense with small moments that stacked on each other and built something. Caleb taught by doing and by asking, never by explaining in advance. He'd start a job, through 2 or 3 steps, and then stop and say, what do you think comes next? Not testing Ryan. Genuinely asking, genuinely interested in the answer, because the answer showed him where Ryan's thinking was and where it needed to go. And Ryan was wrong about 30% of the time. He was right about 70%, which was higher than Caleb had expected and higher. He suspected, decent than Ryan expected. And when Ryan was right, Caleb moved on without comment. And when Ryan was wrong, and Caleb showed him why, and step by step, and without any weight on it, and without the particular shade of impatience that some teachers put on corrections that makes the student feel the failure more than the lesson. Caleb corrected the way his father had corrected him, with complete neutrality and complete specificity, because the goal was understanding, not performance. On Thursday, Ryan had stopped asking whether he should do something and started telling Caleb what he was going to do and why. The shift from question to statement was the thing Caleb had been waiting for without realizing he was waiting for it. That's it, Caleb told him Thursday afternoon. Ryan looked up from the engine he was in. Aunt, that thing you just did, telling me instead of asking me. Caleb leaned against the bench. That's the difference between a guy who works on bikes and a mechanic. Ryan stared at him. That's it? That's the whole thing? The whole thing is the confidence to trust what you know, Caleb said. In technique you can learn from a book. The confidence that only comes from somewhere else. And Ryan was quiet for a moment. He turned back to the engine. My dad never had that, he said, the confidence. He was good at the work. He just never believed he was good enough to hold on to it. In the shop was always in danger of closing, Ryan said. Even when it was doing all right. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was about to fall. He paused, his hands still in the engine. And the bank didn't take the shop because the business failed. The business was okay. They took it because he stopped fighting when they came for him. Just stopped. Caleb let the silence sit for a moment. Then that won't happen to you. Ryan looked up. Why not? Caleb looked at him steadily. Because you're someone who writes questions down, so you don't forget them. People who do that don't stop fighting. Ryan held his gaze for a beat, then looked back at the engine. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders settled in a way that was different from how they'd been carrying themselves since Monday morning, and Caleb noticed it and filed it away and went back to work. It was the end of the second week when the thing happened that neither of them had anticipated. Caleb was under a Dyna-wide glide on the lift when he heard a vehicle pull into the lot that didn't sound like a motorcycle. It sounded like a truck, heavy duty, pulling something. He heard Ryan's footsteps cross the floor and the sound of the bay door going up, and then he heard Ryan say, in a voice that was carefully neutral in the way voices get when the speaker is processing something unexpected, "Caleb, Aunt, you need to come see this." Caleb rolled out from under the lift. He stood up and walked to the bay door and stopped. And there was a flatbed truck in the parking lot. In the flatbed was a motorcycle lift, a professional-grade hydraulic lift, the kind that Caleb had priced out 18 months ago when the old manual lift had started developing the wobble that he'd been compensating for ever since. And the kind that cost $6,000 new. On the cab door of the truck, a man he didn't know was climbing down, holding a clipboard. "Any Whitmore's garage?" the man said. "That's me," Caleb said carefully. The man held out the clipboard. "Delivery from Hale Equipment Solutions." "He already paid for. I just need his signature." Caleb stared at the clipboard. He looked at the lift on the flatbed. He looked at Ryan, who was looking back at him with the expression of someone who has witnessed something they're still in the process of classifying. "Hale Equipment Solutions," Caleb repeated. "Yes, sir." "You want me to put it in the second bay?" Caleb stood there for a moment. And the lift on the flatbed was worth more than 2 months of his previous revenue. It was gleaming and new and absolutely and completely paid for, and there was a delivery man with a clipboard, waiting for a signature, and Ryan was standing 3 feet to his left, trying very hard not to have an expression. "Put it in the second bay," Caleb said. He signed the clipboard. He called Marcus before the truck had finished pulling out. And Marcus picked up on the second ring. "Morning, the lift," Caleb said. "Good timing?" Marcus asked. "Marcus," Caleb's voice was even, but just barely. "And we talked about what this arrangement was." We shook hands on it. "He did. The lift isn't part of the arrangement." And the arrangement was referrals and supplier pricing. "And the lift," Marcus said in the tone of a man who has prepared for this conversation, "is a capital equipment investment in a business I have a financial interest in seeing succeed." Which is what I told my accountant, which is why it went through the business and not my personal account. A pause. "And you want to fight me on the accounting? I'll get you the number for my CPA." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. "Marcus, the old lift had a wobble," Marcus said. "And Ryan told Daniel. Daniel told me." Caleb turned and looked at Ryan. And Ryan suddenly became very interested in the new lift's hydraulic controls. "It was managing the wobble," Caleb said. "I know you were. And you were also managing 19 bikes in the rain on 6 hours of sleep. Managing things is what you do." Marcus's voice dropped slightly, lost the edge of strategy, and became something simpler. "Let somebody else manage something, for once, Caleb. That's not charity. That's just how it's supposed to work." Caleb stood there in the bay door, with his phone against his ear, and the morning light coming in over the mountains, and the new lift sitting in his second bay like a fact he hadn't accounted for. "I'll pay it back," he said finally. "I know you will," Marcus said. "And that's why I did it." He hung up. Caleb put the phone in his pocket. He walked over to the new lift and looked at it. Then he looked at Ryan. "And you told Daniel about the wobble," he said. "I mentioned it," Ryan said carefully. "In what context exactly?" Ryan looked at the lift. "In the context of it came up. And we were talking about the shop, and I said the old lift had developed a lean on the left side, and you'd been compensating by redistributing the load weight, which was technically fine but not ideal for precision work on heavier builds. He paused. He might have mentioned it wasn't ideal. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Next time something like that comes up, he said, "Tell me first." Noted, Ryan said. Then, after a beat, "But it is a good lift." Caleb put his hand on the hydraulic column. The steel was cold and solid and real. Pressed the control, and the platform rose smoothly and evenly, and without any lean and without any wobble, and he stood there watching it rise until it locked in place at the height he wanted. "Yeah," he said, "it's a good lift." He went back to the Dynawide glide. And the third week brought something Caleb hadn't planned for: volume. Not the gradual, manageable increase he'd been anticipating. 2 or 3 new customers a week, a steady fear and anger build, and the kind of growth he could absorb without disrupting the quality of work. Came in the third week was a different kind of momentum entirely. The kind that happens when word moves through a network that has been waiting for something to tell each other. Touring group of 12 riders from Colorado came through on a Wednesday, heading north. 10 of them had a problem that had been developing since Cheyenne, a fuel system issue that had gotten progressively worse over the 300 miles since their last stop, which had been a dealer who charged them $200 to look at it and sent them away with the problem unresolved. They came to Caleb because someone in their group had heard about him from someone else who'd heard about him from someone in the Montana chapters. And the chain of that hearing went back, as nearly as Caleb could trace it, to a single conversation at a gas station outside Billings 2 weeks ago. Caleb and Ryan fixed the fuel system issue in 90 minutes. They charged for the parts and 2 hours of labor. And the rider with the problem shook Caleb's hand and said, "What that dealer charged me, I could have paid for this twice and still come out ahead." "And that dealer had overhead," Caleb said. "So do you." "Different kind," Caleb said. He handed back the keys. "And you've got a long ride. Don't push it above 70 for the first 50 miles. Let the system normalize after the repair." And the rider looked at him for a moment. "You give instructions with every job?" "And with every job where the rider's going somewhere important after," Caleb said. And the rider went back to his group. Caleb heard him telling them something, but he was already back inside and working. And by Friday of the third week, he had more appointments on the books than he'd had in the previous 3 months combined. Stood at the appointment book Friday evening after Ryan had gone home, and he looked at the page and counted the lines and did the math on the projected revenue, and then sat down heavily on the stool. Took the napkin out of the desk drawer. The numbers on it were the same. And the math hadn't changed, but the context of the math had changed entirely. The denominator had shifted, which meant the answer was different, which meant a problem that had seemed fixed was actually a problem that had solved itself, or been solved for him, or been solved by a combination of his own work and other people's choices. And he wasn't sure how to feel about which of those things was true. He sat with the napkin for a long time. Then he got out a new napkin and did the new math. He went through it twice, because the result seemed wrong, and then on the second pass seemed right. And the third time he came out in the same place as the second time, and he sat back and looked at what he'd written and let himself, and carefully and without too much weight on it, believe it. He could make the rent. He could pay Ryan. He could order the parts inventory he'd been holding off on for 6 months. He could fix the hoist in the third bay that had needed a part since February. He could make it work. He'd always believed he could make it work. And that was the thing he hadn't lost. Through all the months and all the math and all the nights lying on the shop floor. Kept believing it the way his father had kept believing it. And even in the hard years And the belief, not as a feeling, but as a practice, a daily decision to act as though the thing you're working for is possible, even when the evidence is thin. And the evidence wasn't thin anymore. He folded the new napkin and put it in his shirt pocket. He threw the old one away. It was a Saturday morning, 10 days later, when Daniel Brooks came back. Came on his bike, alone like Marcus had, and he did the same thing Marcus had done and backed it into the bay Caleb had come to think of informally as the visiting bay and the one closest to the door. He came in the garage and looked around at what had changed a new lift in the second bay. The fuller parts shelves, and Ryan at the bench working a carburetor with the focused and clean-handed confidence of someone who had been doing this for 3 months instead of 3 weeks. And he stood there with his helmet under his arm and a look on his face that was the particular satisfaction of a person in this who predicted something and is watching it arrive. And you look like a man whose gamble paid off, Caleb said. I'm not a gambling man, Daniel said. I was a firefighter. We don't gamble. We calculate. Then you look like a man whose calculation paid off. Daniel smiled. That's more accurate. He set his helmet on the visiting bench. They'd started calling it that. Ryan had started calling it that, and it had stuck and looked at Ryan. How's he treating you? Ryan looked up from the carburetor. He told me I was wrong 4 times in the first week. In the second week, twice. And this week? Ryan paused. He seemed to be considering whether to say the next thing. And then 0, so far. Daniel looked at Caleb with an eyebrow raised. It's Wednesday, Caleb said. Ryan made a sound that might have been a laugh. Angel walked over and looked at what Ryan was working on. And for a few minutes, he asked questions enough that Caleb revised his understanding of how much Daniel knew about engines more than he'd let on during the storm, which made sense. Men who had been competent at a practical skill their whole lives often didn't announce it. You work on your own bikes? Caleb asked him. Used to, Daniel said. Hands aren't what they were. He flexed his right hand slightly, the gesture of a man who didn't want to make more of something than it was. Did my own maintenance for 20 years. Started getting Marcus's guys to do it when the detail work got harder to see. Arthritis? Caleb asked. Yeah, Daniel's voice was even about it. It's manageable. Doesn't stop me from riding. Stops me from the fine work. Caleb nodded. He filed this information the way he filed everything. Not for immediate use, just for accuracy of picture. And what brings you out? He asked. Daniel reached into his jacket and put an envelope on the bench. He did it without ceremony, the way you put something down when you want it to land as a fact rather than a gesture. Caleb looked at the envelope. What is that? 11 riders from the Billings and Bozeman chapters who want to put their bikes on a regular maintenance schedule, Daniel said. Names, bike models, and contact numbers, and what each of them needs, done before winter. And some of them can bring the bikes here. Some need pickup, which I know is a service you don't currently offer, but Marcus wanted me to mention it as a possibility for the future. Caleb looked at the envelope. 11 bikes, he said. To start, Daniel said. There are 9 more who are interested but haven't committed yet. Caleb picked up the envelope. He opened it and looked at the list, which was handwritten in the careful block letters of a man who'd spent 22 years writing incident reports in conditions that required legibility. He looked at the names and the bikes and the notes beside each one, and he was quiet for a long moment. When Marcus laid out this arrangement, Caleb said, I thought he meant word of mouth. People hearing about the shop and deciding to come in. That's what it is, Daniel said. This is more organized than that. And we're an organized group, Daniel said simply. Caleb looked at him. Angel looked back with the complete unruffled calm of a man who has waited out far more complicated things than this conversation. The pickup service, Caleb said finally. I'd need a trailer. The truck I've got can pull one, but I don't own one. Daniel Bilal pulled out his phone. He made a call. He said 4 words into it, he's in on pickup. He hung up. He looked at Caleb. There's a 12-foot enclosed trailer at Marcus's place that's been sitting unused for 2 years. It's yours to use. Caleb stared at him. Caleb, Daniel said, and there was something in his voice now that was different from the strategy and the logistics, and something older and more direct. And did you watch work through the night, in the rain, for people you'd never met? He watched you treat 19 strangers like they were worth your best effort at your worst moment. I watched your daughter hand out granola bars to men twice her size and talk to them like they were people, because that's how you raised her. He paused. We're not doing you a favor. We're paying attention. And there's a difference. Caleb looked at the list in his hand. At the 11 names, at the bikes beside each one. The notes about what each bike needed, written by a man who'd paid close enough attention to know. You need to hire someone for the pickup runs, he said. You can't leave Ryan here alone yet, not for the full-day jobs. And who are you thinking? Caleb looked at Daniel. You said your hands aren't what they were for the fine work. But you can still drive. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I'm retired, he said. I know, Caleb said. I'm asking if you want to not be. And something moved through Daniel Brooks's face that was very quiet and very large. The expression of a man who has not been asked a particular kind of question in a while and finds it landing somewhere unexpected. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. Part-time, Daniel said. Ever works for you, Caleb said. Fair pay. Only kind I know. And Daniel looked around the garage again at Ryan at the bench, at the new lift in the second bay, at the appointment book with its full lines of handwriting. The organized shelves and the tools lined up the way a man's father had lined them up 40 years ago and the way his son had kept them ever since. He picked up his helmet. I'll be here Monday, he said. He walked out. Ryan watched him go. He looked at Caleb. Did you just hire Daniel Brooks? I think so, Caleb said. He was the best emergency responder in Yellowstone County for 15 years, Ryan said. And Marcus talks about him like he's a legend. Legends need something to do, Caleb said. He put the envelope in the appointment book and went back to the Dynawide Glide that was waiting on the new lift. And you going to finish that carburetor or talk about it? And Ryan went back to the carburetor in the garage, filled with the sound of work, and steady and purposeful and real. And outside on the highway, the Montana afternoon moved toward evening, and somewhere out on the Beer Tooth Corridor, the riders were moving too. And the word still traveling along the network, and one conversation at a time, and building towards something that Caleb Whitmore had made it his business to understand how things worked and was only beginning to see the full shape of. And became the way. Important Mondays always come without announcing itself as important, just arriving like any morning coffee and cold air and the particular sounds of a garage waking up. And Daniel was there at 7:45, not because Caleb had told him what time to be there, because Daniel Brooks had spent 22 years showing up before the emergency arrived, and that particular habit had outlasted the career that built it. Backed his truck into the lot, came through the bay door, and looked at the coffee situation, did a judgment about it, and started a fresh pot without asking whether the existing pot was still good. Wasn't. Caleb had made it at 6:30, and it was past saving. And Daniel had known this from the color of it through the glass carafe without tasting it, which was the kind of assessment that impressed Caleb more than Daniel probably knew. And Ryan came in at 7:58, notebook in his back pocket. Looked at Daniel, looked at Caleb, looked at the fresh coffee. Made a new pot, Ryan said. I did, Daniel said. And the old one wasn't that bad. And the old one, Daniel said, Dan with the patient certainty of a man who has made this evaluation many times. It's a crime. It can't. And Ryan poured himself a cup of the new pot. He drank it. He said nothing, which was confirmation. Caleb stood at the appointment board. He'd moved from the spiral notebook to an actual whiteboard, which was a change that had felt significant in a way he hadn't expected. When he'd put it up and he looked at the day's work. In 7 appointments, 3 pickups that Daniel would handle with the trailer. 4 in shop jobs, 2 of which were straightforward enough that Ryan could run them start to finish with Caleb available if he hit something unexpected. It was the most structured morning he'd had in 14 years of owning the shop. Stood there, looking at the board for a moment. "You all right?" Ryan asked. 7 appointments, Caleb said. "I know. I put 3 of them on the board last night. And we had 2 appointments on a Monday 6 weeks ago." And Ryan looked at the board, then at Caleb. "Is that a problem?" Caleb thought about the word problem and what it meant in the context of too much work after a long season of too little, and he decided the word didn't fit. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." He picked up his coffee. And let's go. They went. The first appointment of the day was Pete Sarver, coming back for a follow-up on the Road King. The bearing Caleb had replaced 6 weeks ago was holding clean, and Pete knew it. He hadn't come in because something was wrong. Come in because he'd decided this was the shop where he got his bike looked at, and that decision had a rhythm to it that he was establishing. And Pete shook Caleb's hand when he came in, which he'd started doing at the second visit and had done every visit since. And he shook Ryan's hand, and he nodded at Daniel, who he'd met at a chapter gathering and whose presence in the garage he absorbed without surprise, because by now, nothing about Whitmore's garage surprised Pete Sarver. "How's she running?" Caleb asked. "Perfect," Pete said. "That's why I'm here. I want you to hear it running perfect so you know your baseline." Caleb looked at him. "So I know my baseline for the next time something goes wrong. And you should hear what right sounds like before you hear what wrong sounds like." Pete said it with complete seriousness. Caleb was quiet for a moment, and he went outside and listened to the Road King idle for 90 seconds, his eyes closed, and came back in and said, "And I know my baseline." Pete seemed satisfied. He stayed for coffee and talked with Daniel for 20 minutes about a ride they were both planning for the spring. And then he left, and the day continued. And the garage moved through its appointments with the steady, purposeful momentum that Caleb was still getting used to, the feeling of a machine running right. Around 11, Emma came through the apartment door. And she did this sometimes on school half days. And this was the school district's quarterly early release, and the one she'd been reminding him about for 2 weeks. In the careful, detail-oriented way, she managed information she thought her father might misplace. And he came in with her backpack on and her sketchbook in her hand, and she assessed the garage in her systematic way and then went directly to Daniel. "You came back," she said. "I work here now," Daniel said. "Emma processed this. Are you good at it?" "Getting there," Daniel said. And she seemed to find this acceptable. She looked at Ryan. "And your hip is completely better." And Ryan, who had stopped bracing for these assessments weeks ago and now simply received them as the facts they were, said, "And 100%. Hey, good." She pulled out her sketchbook and found a spot on the upturned crate near the bench, her spot, the one she'd claimed the night of the storm, and that had remained informally hers ever since, and she opened it and began drawing. Caleb watched his daughter settle into his garage the way she'd always settled into it. And since she was small enough to sleep in the parts bin he'd lined with a moving blanket, and he thought about what Daniel had said weeks ago. That sometimes you had to know somebody before you knew who they were. He thought about Emma handing out granola bars at midnight with the seriousness of a logistician. And he thought about her telling Ryan his hip was better because of the heat. And he thought about who she was and where she'd learned it and how much of it she'd built herself. "I'm dad," Emma said, without looking up from her sketchbook. "Yeah." Marcus is outside. Caleb turned. Through the shop window, he could see the parking lot, and he could see Marcus's bike, which he'd learned to recognize by its sound before it arrived and by its profile once it was stopped. Marcus was off the bike and standing beside it, not moving toward the door yet, just standing. Like he was thinking through something. Caleb went outside. And Marcus heard him coming and turned. He looked different. Bad different. But Hump's thing had shifted in the particular way he was carrying himself, something Caleb couldn't immediately classify. "You've got a minute?" Marcus said. "I've got 7 appointments, and Daniel's handling 3 of them," Caleb said. "And I've got a minute." He stood beside Marcus's bike in the morning cold, and not going back inside, in which told Caleb this was a conversation Marcus wanted to have outside the garage and away from the work and the people. "Hey, I want to tell you something," Marcus said. "All right." "And we left here 6 weeks ago." Marcus paused, choosing the words with the care of a man who doesn't usually choose words this carefully. "I made a call to my guys before we cleared the mountain. Told them about you. I told them about this garage and what you did and who you are." He looked at Caleb directly. You know what the response was? From 19 guys who just spent 9 hours in someone's garage after being turned away from 17 others. "What?" To a man, Marcus said they wanted it to come back. He let that land for a moment. "And to repay you, not because they felt they owed you. They wanted to come back because they'd spent a night in a place that treated them like they were worth something. And that is not as common as you might think." Caleb looked at him. "I know it's not common," Caleb said quietly. "You know you do." Marcus's voice shifted into something lower and more direct. What I want to tell you is this. The arrangement we have, the referrals, the business, that's real, and I stand by it. But that's not why I came back today." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a photograph, and held it out. Caleb took it. It was a photograph of a motorcycle, not just any motorcycle. He knew it before he'd looked at it for 3 full seconds. Knew it the way you know a face from childhood, the way something bypasses reasoning and arrives directly in the body. In the lines of it, the tank shape, the specific chrome configuration that had been his father's particular taste and no one else's. His father's motorcycle, the one he'd sold 2 years ago to cover 3 months of back rent. Stared at the photograph. "Where did you get this?" he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "And I asked around," Marcus said simply. "When Daniel told me about it, that you'd sold it, what it meant, why I asked around. It took about 3 weeks to locate it. It's in Wyoming. And guy who bought it from the second owner, kept it in good shape, hasn't touched the engine, just stored it." A pause. "He's willing to sell." Caleb looked up from the photograph. His hands were still holding it, and his hands were not moving. "And Marcus, I'm not buying it for you," Marcus said, with the particular firmness of a man heading off an argument before it forms. "I'm telling you it's findable. I'm telling you who has it and what he wants for it. What you do with that is your business." Caleb looked back at the photograph. The motorcycle in the picture was his father's. His father had bought it the year Caleb was born. He'd ridden it for 27 years and kept it the way Caleb kept everything, with complete, meticulous, loving care, and when he died, he'd left it to Caleb with the same absence of drama with which he'd left him everything else. In letter. No instruction, just the understanding that Caleb knew what it was, and what it meant and what to do with it. Caleb had sold it on a Tuesday morning alone, and he'd driven home and sat in the garage for a long time, and he hadn't told anyone, and he'd put the money in the account and paid the rent and kept going. Because keeping going was the whole job. He handed the photograph back. "Keep it," Marcus said. Caleb looked at him. "Keep it," Marcus said again. "So you know it exists. So you know where it is." Caleb folded the photograph carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, where the napkins had lived, both the old one and the new one. Put it there, because that was the pocket where he kept the things that were too important to put somewhere. He couldn't feel them. "Thank you," he said. Marcus nodded. "How's the business?" And the shift was deliberate, and Caleb accepted it, because Marcus was right. The other thing was said, and it didn't need more words. 7 appointments today. We're booked out 10 days. You need another mechanic. I know. You know who to call. And Ryan's not ready to be unsupervised full-time yet. I didn't say Ryan, Marcus said. He looked at Caleb steadily. And there's a guy in the Missoula chapter. Name is Frank Odom. In 30 years as a dealership mechanic, and retired last year, and bored out of his mind, his wife has told him she will personally burn down the house if he spends one more winter rearranging the garage. He paused. He's a better mechanic than me. Telling you about him is going to convey. I'd have sent him to you sooner, but I wanted to see if you were ready. For what? Ready to let someone in who you don't already know. Marcus held his gaze. And that's been the pattern, Caleb. You let Ryan in because you watched him work for 9 hours. Let Daniel in because he held a flashlight for 4. And you do that with everyone. You need to see the work before you trust the person. He wasn't saying it as a criticism. He was saying it as the observation it was. Frank Odom is going to come in as a stranger. I'm asking you to trust him anyway. Caleb was quiet. And send him in, he said. Marcus almost smiled. He'll be here Thursday. He got back on his bike. He started it, and the sound of it was the good sound, and the clean and even sound, and the sound of an engine that had been built right and maintained right and was running exactly as designed. Caleb had put 4 hours into that bike 2 weeks ago. And he'd heard that in the startup, the way you hear your own work when it's running, the satisfaction that didn't need anything added to it. Any hollow, Marcus pulled out. Caleb went back inside. Ryan was elbow deep in the second bay job and had a question about the cylinder timing that he'd been sitting on, waiting for Caleb to come back. Because he'd learned by now which questions to ask immediately, and which ones were worth sitting with until the right moment. He asked it cleanly and specifically, and Caleb answered it the same way, and Ryan went back to work, and the garage moved back into its rhythm. Angel came in from the first pickup run at noon with the bike secured in the trailer and a bag of sandwiches from the place in town that Emma called the Good Sandwich Place, distinguishing it from the place 2 blocks further that she called the Sandwich Place with the disappointing pickles. Set the sandwiches on the bench, and everyone stopped and ate standing up, the way people eat in garages. And Emma came and got her sandwich and went back to her crate and her sketchbook without interrupting her drawing more than necessary. "Annie, what are you drawing?" Ryan asked her. She held up the sketchbook. It was the garage. In the interior of it, entered in the careful pencil lines of a kid who'd been watching things closely her whole life, the lift in the second bay, in the bench, into the tool organization her father had maintained since before she was born. And in the drawing, in 3 figures, and one under a bike on the lift, and C had D at the bench, and one near the door. And small, economical, accurate. "That's us," Ryan said. And obviously, Emma said. She went back to drawing. Ryan looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the drawing for a moment. The garage, as daughter saw it, populated and purposeful and alive, and then he went back to his sandwich. Frank Odom arrived Thursday at 9 in the morning. He was 61, with the broad, flat hands of a career mechanic and the kind of physical quietness that comes from spending decades in spaces where unnecessary movement is inefficiency. He drove a truck that was older than Ryan and in better shape than most new ones. He walked into the garage and looked at the setup with the practiced eye of a man who has assessed a lot of shops over a long career and said to Caleb, and without preamble, you keep your own torque specs or you go by book? Both, Caleb said. Book for baseline, my own notes for anything where the book is optimistic. Frank looked at him for a moment. Optimistic, he repeated. The torque spec on the primary housing bolt for a twin cam assumes the threading is perfect, Caleb said. In a bike with 60,000 miles, the threading is not perfect. You go by book, you're either under-torquing or you're pulling the thread. You need to know what the specific bike has got. Frank was quiet for a long 5 seconds. And he said, when do I start? You started when you asked the question, Caleb said. And Frank went to the bench and assessed the tool organization with the eye of a man who had opinions about tool organization and was determining whether his opinions and the existing reality were compatible, determined apparently that they were. Picked up the job sheet for the bike in the third bay. And then Ryan watched this from the second bay. He looked at Caleb. Caleb gave him a look that meant, keep working. Ryan kept working. In EDE, by noon, Frank had diagnosed 2 issues that had been on the job sheet as unknowns and found a third that hadn't been on the sheet at all. He presented all 3 to Caleb with the efficiency of a man who has written a lot of diagnostic reports, clear, specific, no unnecessary words, and Caleb went through them and found himself in complete agreement on all 3, which was the most reliable endorsement he knew. You'll do, Caleb told him. Frank nodded once. He went back to the bike. Daniel, who had been watching Frank the way he'd watched everything in his career, systematically, from a position of apparent disinterest, came to stand beside Caleb. Marcus was right about him, Daniel said low. Marcus is right about most things, Caleb said. Don't tell him I said that. He already knows, Daniel said. And he went to start the afternoon's pickup run. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that Caleb's struggled to name for a long time. And then one evening in November, and standing at the bench after everyone had gone home and the garage was quiet and the first real cold of winter had arrived and was pressing against the walls, he found the word. And full. And not financially full, and though the numbers were doing what numbers should do when a business is working, growing steadily, meeting their obligations, leaving a margin that was small but real and getting less small each month. Not just professionally full, though the work was more than it had been and better than it had been, and he had people around him who made it better still. And full the way a life is full when it's being lived completely. When the people in it are real and the work is real and the effort you put in has a shape you can see. Stood at the bench and thought about the photograph in his shirt pocket. Looked at it every day, not with grief or not only with grief, and with something more complicated in the recognition that some things you lose are not lost permanently. They're just lost for now. And the patience to understand the difference between those two things was its own kind of skill that you built the same way you built every other skill, by practicing in it when it was hard. Picked up his phone. He dialed the number Marcus had given him. And the man in Wyoming answered on the 3rd ring. His name was Carl Weston, and he had bought the motorcycle from a man who hadn't known what he had, which Carl had known from the first time he saw it and had paid accordingly. Kept it in a heated storage unit. He rode it twice a year, carefully. He had not done anything to it that was permanent or irreversible, and which told Caleb, in the DO, from the first 2 minutes of the conversation, everything he needed to know about Carl Weston's character. He talked for 35 minutes. By the end of the conversation, they had a price. It was not cheap. It was not beyond reach. It was a number that existed in the space between those two things. The space where fair transactions happen, when both people involved are being honest about what something is worth. "How soon can you come get it?" Carl asked. Caleb looked at the calendar on the shop wall. "In 3 weeks," he said. "I've got to arrange the transport." "I'll have it ready," Carl said. Caleb hung up. He stood in the quiet garage for a long moment. Then he went to the apartment door and opened it. Emma was at the kitchen table with her homework. She looked up. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. And she put down her pencil. She gave him her full attention, the way she did when she understood that full attention was what was needed. "In your grandfather's motorcycle," Caleb said. "I sold it 2 years ago. And I should have told you then, and I didn't, and I'm sorry." Emma looked at him. Her face was doing the processing thing. "Annie, why did you sell it?" "To keep the shop." She was quiet for a moment. "Annie, Grandpa would have said to sell it," she said. "I know he would have. He would have said the shop was worth more than the motorcycle. You know that too. So why are you telling me now?" Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "Because I found it. And I bought it back, and it's coming home in 3 weeks. He paused. "And I should have told you the truth instead of carrying it alone." Emma looked at him for a long moment with the serious, clear-eyed steadiness that was the most her mother thing about her. "Okay," she said. "Okay? I mean," she picked up her pencil again. "I'm glad it's coming back." "But I already knew, Dad." Caleb stared at her. "What?" "It was 9, and not 4. And she said, and with the patient precision of a person correcting a factual error. "You knew the motorcycle was gone. I could tell by the way you walked past where it used to be." She looked at her homework. "And you'd tell me when you were ready." He stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter, who was 9 years old and had known for 2 years and had waited without asking her. Patient in the way of a child who has learned that the adults she loves are carrying things that take time to put down. He crossed the kitchen and hugged her from behind, and her homework still on the table in front of her, and she let him and to put one hand over his for a moment. "Maybe 3 weeks," she said. 3 weeks, he said. He went back to the garage. Stood at the bench where his father had stood. He stood at the bench where his father had stood with the tools his father had bought and the habits his father had built and the understanding his father had tried to give him from the very beginning. And that the measure of a life was not what you accumulated, but what you built. And the measure of what you built was not how much it was worth, but how many people it was worth something to. And he thought about the night of the storm, the bay door rolling up, and the lights spilling out, Marcus Hale in the rain, expecting one more door to close, and finding, instead, a door that opened. He thought about what it had cost him to open it. Nothing. Nothing it had cost him anything to give. Just the choice, the same choice, his father had made 100 times in 20 years in this garage. So many times it had stopped being a choice and become simply who he was. Thought about Ryan Cole and had arrived with a notebook and a hip injury and a dead man's grief about a lost shop and who was now at this bench more hours than Caleb and learning to work with the focused, growing certainty of someone who has finally found the thing they were supposed to do. He thought about Daniel Brooks, who had held a flashlight through the long night and come back because he'd paid attention and understood what he'd seen. And he thought about Frank Odom, who had walked into a stranger's garage and asked the right question before he'd even put down his keys. And he thought about Emma, who had handed out granola bars at midnight and waited 2 years for her father to be ready to tell her the truth. Put his hand flat on the bench. The wood was worn smooth from decades of the same gesture, his father's hand, his own hand, the unconscious habit of a person touching the thing that holds them. And he's outside. The Montana night had settled completely over the mountains. And the highway was quiet. The Beartooth Pass was dark. And somewhere between here and Wyoming, a motorcycle that had once belonged to a man who believed in open doors was waiting to come home. The garage that nearly died because one man refused to close its doors in a storm was now, 6 months later, the most trusted motorcycle shop in 3 counties. And the man who had worked through the night alone was no longer alone. Annie, the daughter who had put herself to bed at 8:30 because she understood. Her father was still working, now fell asleep to the sound of voices in the garage below, her Ryan locking up Daniel's truck in the lot, and the ordinary sounds of a place that was full of people who had decided it was worth showing up for. Caleb turned off the bench light. He stood in the dark garage for a moment, the way his father used to do, at the end of a long day, not because there was anything left to check, and because the garage, at the end of a good day, had a quality that deserved a moment of quiet recognition. And he went to bed. Because a man who opens his door to the world when the world needs him most does not do it once and call it done. He does it every day, in every way available to him, for as long as he is standing. It is not a sacrifice. That is not even a virtue. It is simply when a person has understood, at some deep and unargued level, what they are here to do. Caleb Whitmore understood it. His father had taught him. And now in a garage in Montana, he was teaching it to everyone who walked through the door he refused to close. And they, in turn, making sure he never had to stand alone again.